Very good afternoon or very good evening, as the case may be, everyone. Pleasure to see you all, some very familiar faces, regulars at the seminar, as well as new participants. Very warm welcome, everyone. And of course, it's a delight to be able to welcome as a speaker today, Dr. Lisa Pilar Eberle, Assistant Professor at the University of Tübingen. Lisa's interests are very wide-ranging indeed. She's probably best known so far for her, I think fair to say, groundbreaking work on the Roman diaspora in the Greek East and the Italian diaspora in the Greek East. Some extremely important pieces, one co-authored with Enorale Quere in JRS 2017, another one on citizenship in the time of Augustus in Tapa 2017. But her interests really do range more widely across the history of the Mediterranean in antiquity, across a rather large, really, time span. And they do bring into the equation material culture, as well as legal developments, administrative structures, and indeed dynamics of gender and empire in the Roman world and beyond. She's a graduate of University of Oxford. She studied at St. Hilda's, where she also returned after her Berkeley PhD as a junior research fellow. She's been at Tübingen since 2016, and she's also had a stint as a visiting lecturer at Marseille Université in France. She's currently working on a habilitation project. Well, it's a process in itself, I suppose, but it's a project. It is. It's a process, on emigration and its consequences in the ancient Mediterranean in the archaic Greek period, sort of 800, 500 BC. So yes, much of her work indeed is on the Mediterranean dimension of ancient history. Her paper today, though, takes us, I think, rather firmly back to Rome, and indeed back to this very stimulating side of her interests, so the intersection between legal and economic developments in the wider, of course, political framework. And her title today is The Edicts of the Praetors, Politics, Law, and Revolution in Ancient Rome. Lisa, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Federico, for this really, really kind introduction. And also in general, thank you to you and thank you to Mattia for organizing this colloquium and for inviting me to a part of it. So over these past weeks, I personally at least have greatly enjoyed thinking about Roman history and what I think has been a really, really kind and a really congenial and productive atmosphere, as well as across borders that these days just seem increasingly difficult to cross. So today, as my way of thanks, I'm very pleased now to be able to finally offer up something in return. And what I'm presenting today is very much new, right? So it fits really into the framework of this colloquium. But as such, let me highlight, it's very much work in progress. And so I'm saying this here really at the beginning, of course, because captatio benevolentia, etc., but also to underline that I do really look forward to our discussion at the end, because I suspect that it will really help me make this project better. So what I'm presenting today works, I hope, as a standalone piece, but it's also a preliminary inquiry for what I think could be a larger project. And this larger project, which really, let's be honest, currently only dream about, is a social, economic, and political history of the Praetorian Edict from the 2nd century BCE to the 2nd century CE. The much more limited goal of my paper today is to think about how and why such a project could indeed be of historical interest. And so in short, I will suggest that we should move beyond considering the Praetorian Edict as a source of law, which is how it mainly features in Roman law textbooks, and instead I want to recover the edict as a social practice with political, economic, and, well, yes, legal dimensions. And today I'll argue that once we take this practice perspective seriously, the collective singular, the Praetorian Edict, appears to be increasingly problematic. Above all, because this practice perspective calls into question the shape of the history that we might imagine for this edict. So in the few treatments of the history of the Praetorian Edict that I've been able to find, and there'll be some more details on them later, but broadly speaking, in these treatments, this history of the edict is indeed imagined as a form of incremental development consisting mainly of additions. By contrast, I want to suggest that the history of edict actually was a much more haphazard affair, with some magistrates including clauses that would then never be used again, while other clauses that had once been innovations indeed survived more or less intact for centuries, and really then also being a lot of gray cases in between these two extremes. More fundamentally, I'll argue that each magistrate quite likely put at least some degree of thought and reflection into his edict. Thought and reflection that can and should, I think, be the object of historical analysis. And so once we adopt this plural perspective, once we begin thinking about the edicts of the Praetors and not the Praetorian Edict, it becomes readily apparent that these edicts were not only an integral part of Roman legal culture, but that they also played an important role in Roman politics more broadly. At the most general level, I'll suggest that we can see the edicts as a highly peculiar way of configuring law and politics, a way that is profoundly different from the way in which law and politics are configured in modern nation states today. Unlike modern law, which is predicated on continuity and as such fears the exception, Roman legal culture would appear to have had regular annual exception or variation, I think we should say, built in. Polemically put then, Roman legal culture, unlike modern law today, could potentially encompass revolution. In an attempt to make these ideas seem vaguely plausible, I've divided my paper into 4 parts, which you also see reflected on the handout. First, I'll outline what I think Roman edicts amounted to as practice, and I'll suggest that the ancients did actually understand them as practice too. Then I'll turn to critically examine some of the arguments of scholars who like to see the edict as a stabilized text undergoing only incremental change. And I'll suggest that as much there might be some evidence to support this picture, there would actually appear to be more evidence to suggest that edicts and the provisions actually had a much more tumultuous history. And in the second half of my paper then, I explore what happens once we take these heretofore neglected evidence seriously. In the third part, I'll examine the relatively rich Republican evidence for the making of provincial edicts and explore the factors that work to stabilize and destabilize these texts. And in the fourth part, I'll then turn to the edicts as the Praetors in Rome. I'll turn to the edicts of the Praetors in Rome, which our evidence illuminates from rather different angles than those in the provinces, but to suggest that similar forces might actually also have been at work and at play there. A brief summary will then conclude the chapter. So let me begin then by thinking about Roman edicts as practice. That's part 1. At the most basic level, an edictum was the pronouncement of a Roman magistrate. Edico, edicere was how the Latin language encoded and separated off the speech of office holders in Rome. As such, edicts were a thing that Roman magistrates did. They were what they said. Such pronouncements could pertain to different matters, but by the 1st century BCE at the latest, a certain subset of Roman magistrates were in the habit of making pronouncements about the kind of legal cases that they were going to hear during their time in office. These magistrates were the aediles and the Prietos in Rome, as well as Roman magistrates in the provinces. These legal or judicial edicts, as I'll call them, were indeed important sources of law and legal development in the Middle and Late Republic. However, I think it would be wrong to understand them as disembodied legal texts. Instead, their rhetoric continued to be that of magistrates' pronouncements, and as such, it was profoundly personal. In essence, the Edict of the Praetor Urbanus was a list of sentences with verbs, mostly in the first person singular, often in the future tense. Jubebo, dabo, interdictum, veto fieri. And so on the handout, on 1A, you can find one example of such an announcement of intention. The matter in hand was missio in possessionem, the circumstances under which the praetor will order a change in possession. one case in which he promised to do so was when orphans came of age. More generally then, these edicts were pronouncements about what the magistrate in question was going to do in any particular year. They were statements about the magistrate's commitments, a program of sorts, I would suggest. So as programmatic pronouncements of individual magistrates, judicial edicts were not only read out aloud, they were also displayed publicly, and contemporaries seemed to have read them. Like most public writing in the Greco-Roman world that was useful and meaningful only for a limited amount of time, judicial edicts were published on wooden boards, made white with chalk and plaster. The individual clauses of the edicts were written in black, with section headings painted in red. The language in which contemporaries talked about the edict would seem to reflect this publishing practice. Classical jurists, for instance, knew the subsections of edicts as rubricae, red letters, or rubrics, which seem to go back to their appearance in published and in publicized form. Also, the edict as a whole could be referred to as album, or the white thing, the white board, a designation that again testifies to the intimate connection between these texts and their public materiality. And so just for instance, consider the passage from the Augustan Juris Labio, which I put on handout under 1C. Here, Labio imagined two litigants standing in front of the album, the edict, with the plaintiff pointing out the action according to which he was going to sue the defendant. Apart from documenting the semantic slip between edictum and album, this passage will also indicate that contemporaries actually read the judicial edicts of magistrates. And there is further evidence in support of this suggestion. In the passage from the Epistolae Morales, which you find under 1D on the handout, Seneca conceded that if somebody was running after a midwife for his daughter, he would not stop to read the edictum or the annual schedule of games. The singular of edictum and its pairing with the schedule of games makes it likely that Seneca here was indeed thinking of the judicial edict of the Praetor Urbanus in Rome. Overall, I think Seneca's argument would seem to build on the idea that under different circumstances, people might well read these forms of temporary public writing, which, so I would suggest, included the judicial edicts of Roman magistrates. For the Principate, it seems rather likely that the edicts of the Praetors in Rome occupied an assigned place in the Forum Augustum, and the Lexia Nitana made sure that copies of governor's edicts were set up in each municipium of the province. In sum then, we might conclude that the judicial edicts were not only phrased as programmatic pronouncements by magistrates. The intimate connection between their public appearance and the lexicon used to describe them, as well as a range of passages describing how people read them, would seem to indicate that contemporaries did indeed also treat them as such programmatic pronouncements. As such, edict should be seen as part of the communicative practices that made up Roman political life and culture. And so in the second half of my talk, I'll analyze some of the dynamics that might have shaped the composition and reception of judicial edicts in the context of this political life. However, before doing so, I now want to turn in my second part of the paper to examining a tradition of scholarship that seems to me to have been instrumental in separating off judicial edicts from our understanding of Roman political life. And that, broadly speaking, is the history of Roman law, as written by scholars with legal training from the 19th century onwards. So already from this characterization, you can see that I'll be generalizing really, really broadly, which makes me very, very vulnerable, but I think more or less what I'll say is defensible. We'll see how it pans out. Okay. So to begin with, it should be noted that I've not been able to find much scholarship actually on Roman edicts and their histories, even among Roman scholars of law, even among scholars of Roman law. And so by and large, this marginalization of edicts would appear to be a byproduct of the disproportional prominence that jurisprudence occupies within the history and scholarship on Roman law more generally. And this prominence, I think, to some degree at least, ultimately goes back to Friedrich Karl von Savigny, his Historische Rechtsschule, and the ways in which this approach to Roman law vilified the enactment of law, whether by codification or by statute, and praised the work of jurists instead. By contrast, in the Anglophone tradition, the English chancellor's involvement in developing the law of equity has long been considered an analogue for Roman magistrates and their judicial edicts, albeit, I think, ultimately a misleading one. But as a result of this parallel, it should not come as a surprise that most of the sustained and influential treatments of the history of judicial edicts in Rome did actually not originate in the German, but in the Anglophone traditions of scholarship on Roman law. But I think also here it's important that in the 1960s and 70s, scholars such as Kelly and Watson could write about the darkness and the lack of scholarship on the edict and its history. And I think by and large, apart from their work, these diagnoses would still, to some degree, ring true today. With that in mind, almost all the scholarship on judicial edicts that I've been able to find highlights the programmatic nature of edicts, of which I've talked about in my first part, and the way in which their provisions were tied to individual magistrates. At the same time, these same scholars also work really hard to deny the individual saliency of these programs. According to them, magistrates simply took over their predecessors' edicts, and innovation was simply a matter of addition. And explanations in the scholarship for this pattern would seem to vary, but I think they share a certain sort of elliptical quality. So to illustrate, Franz Wiecker suggested that taking over one's predecessor's edict was a matter of technical necessity, technische Notwendigkeit. Benjamin Kunkel wrote that Prietos did so begreiflicherweise, as can readily comprehend it, without elaborating further just why this would be so. A bit more explicit, Alan Watson posited that the legal development that we can trace in the edicts actually was the work of jurists. And I think when pushed, Wiecker and Kunkel would actually sort of point in the same direction. Furthermore, with Wiecker, we do know that he also posited Roman scribai, right? The few but distinct employees of the Roman state as guardians of judicial edicts who supposedly ensured their conservative tendencies. And so now I just want to make two observations in relation to these arguments. One, it should be clear how this general emphasis on conservatism and the explanations that were marshaled for it sealed off the edicts from discussions of Roman politics, more broadly speaking. In spite of what the rhetoric of edicts might suggest, right? So all magistrates saying, here's what I'll do this year. These texts were not in the hands of Roman magistrates, according to these scholars, though instead they were the work of legal and memory specialists. And my second point now relates to the evidence that one might muster to support this picture. And to put it bluntly, maybe overly bluntly, to me this evidence would appear to be somewhere between non-existent and non-probative. So as regards scribai and their involvement in the composition of the edict, I have not been able to find a single piece of evidence for it. In his 2020 monograph on Roman scribai, Benjamin Hartmann does not seem to have found one either. In fact, his arguments would suggest that while Roman scribai were profoundly involved with public writing, this was the kind of public writing that was not published for the public, right? Instead, they were focused on archiving and on record keeping. As such, their writing practices involved tablets and incising. That's what all the iconography of scribai seems to be about, these massive wax tablets, and then scribbling away on it. And it does not seem to have involved whiteboards and painting, which is what these edicts are really about. Well, scribai might indeed have committed edicts to such wax tablets, right? I think we just simply cannot exclude the possibility. The language used to talk about edicts suggests that contemporaries, from jurists to litigants, engage with these texts in their publicized form, as were put up in fora, essentially all throughout the empire, including in the city of Rome. So once we turn from scribai to jurists, there would appear to be at least one passage that can be read to make plausible the notion that jurists were indeed involved in the composition of edicts. According to Cicero, there were members of concilia in difficult legal cases. But it's just not clear if these were the concilia of judges or those of magistrates, right? So that's the uncertainty here. But in spite of this uncertainty, it does seem rather likely that men claiming jurisprudential expertise were at times members of magistrates' concilia. That, from everything we know about them, that seems excessively plausible. However, on these concilia, these judicial experts were one among many members of such concilia, and just also who they were, right? What jurists would then always be a member of such a concilium will have changed from magistrate to magistrate, so from year to year. And so as a result, I think that while these jurists might have well been on the concilia, we cannot really plausibly postulate that they contributed in any meaningful way to the continuity of an edict's text, because jurists are, jurists like to fight each other. They like to debate the law, and they like to not agree with each other, right? So there is that point to be made, which makes it unlikely that we should imagine them to have any stabilizing influence on edicts. Okay. That being said, I think there's also good reason for why these scholars all want to posit some degree of stability in the judicial edicts of magistrates. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, men like Servius Sulpicius or Aulus Ophelius did indeed compose some type of commentaries, although very likely they were all very, very short, on the edict of the Praetor Urbanus. So if the composition of these edicts had been completely random and without any repetition or consistency, such texts would indeed be hard to imagine. Still, in what follows, I'll suggest that there actually exists a substantial body of evidence that testifies to the possibility and to the existence of substantial annual change and variation. And so here now I just want to point out that by privileging the comparatively meager evidence for imitation and stability, standard accounts of the history of judicial edicts would appear to mold edicts as a legal practice in the image of modern ideals of law, emphasizing continuity throughout time and independence from politics. And in so doing, they made judicial edicts as legal practice more familiar to modern eyes than I think they should be. Differently put, these standard accounts would appear to paper over what to modern eyes might indeed seem profoundly uncanny about this legal practice: the possibility that the law that was being enforced in Rome could indeed change on a yearly basis. And so examining our evidence for the making of provincial edicts, which I'll now go on to do, would seem to indicate that in the provinces at least this scenario was no mere possibility, but in fact a widespread phenomenon. So here then, I now move to the third part of my paper, of my presentation, the making of provincial edicts in the Republic. And I want to begin with a passage from Cicero's Variants, which actually refers to Varus' time as a praetor in Rome. After his election and before taking office, Varus set about composing his edict according to the desires of those men that bought provisions from him according to their own interests and needs. Cicero clearly intended this portrayal to provoke outrage among his audience. But just what was his audience to be outraged about? And so there would appear to be three layers to the situation that Cicero evoked. One, Varus composed his edict. Two, he did so with a view to the utilitas, to the interests of certain individuals. And then those individuals paid him for the inclusion of certain provisions in the edict. Okay, so I think we can be quite certain, right? This is a repetundi trial, that one thing that Cicero intended his audience to be really outraged about was the buying and selling of provisions, right? That's the edictal nandinae that Varus allegedly conducted. By contrast, I would suggest that the phrasing of the passage makes it likely that the act of composition in itself was not what might have bothered Cicero or his audience, right? That would appear to have been standard practice for a praetor designatus. More controversially, I want to argue that the involvement of individuals or groups in the process of composition of individual edicts might also not have seemed that scandalous at the time. In fact, this is precisely one of the dynamics that we find when Cicero composed his own edict for the province of Cilicia in 5150 BCE. Overall, we know about Cicero's own process of composition through at least 5 letters that he wrote in the spring and summer of 51 BCE. 4 of them to Atticus and 1 of them to Appius Claudius, his predecessor as governor of Cilicia. And you find the various passages under 3b through to 3e on the handout. And so in what follows, I'll roughly discuss them in the order in which you find them there, but I'll also have to jump back and forth a bit, so please just bear with me. But I want to begin with the first letter, and that's the letter to Appius Claudius. And this letter would appear to respond to an accusatory note from Claudius in which he had accused Cicero of including provisions in his edict that were intended to hurt Claudius. Cicero firmly denied the charge. As part of his defense, he recounted a meeting that he had with the Cilician Publicani on Samos. On that occasion, these men asked him to copy a provision from Claudius's edict and to integrate it into his own. Cicero readily obliged them, he said, adding that this was the only provision that he had added to his edict after leaving Rome. For one, then, you can begin to see here that Cicero did not simply take over his predecessor's edict. In fact, others had to prompt him to include one of Claudius's provisions. In the remaining 4 letters, we find various details that would confirm this picture, not least the fact that Cicero seems to have consulted various other edicts, including those of Mucius Scaevola and Licinius Crassus, both governors of Asia in the early 1st century BCE. Moreover, this little episode also provides glimpses of a process that does not seem that dissimilar from what Cicero had claimed that Varus had been doing as Praetor Designatus. To be sure, there is no mention of selling or of Cicero receiving anything in return for including the provision. However, it really, I think, does not seem far-fetched to think that the Publicani did look to their utilitas when they asked Cicero for the inclusion of this specific provision. Cicero does not appear to have taken issue with this possibility. Instead, as I've already said, he obliged them. Earlier in the year, when Cicero was still in Italy, he seems to have been engaged in an intense letter exchange with Atticus. Today, we only have highly elliptical reflections of the many letters and topics of conversation that this exchange included. And we can see them, we can see glimpses of this exchange in the first few letters in Ad Atticum, Book 5. And some of the matters that the two friends discussed as part of this exchange concerned the ways in which Atticus was to handle certain issues in Cicero's absence. Right? This was well known. Other issues, however, pertain to Cicero's own actions in his province. For instance, Atticus seems to have procured for him a copy of one of the provincial edicts that Cicero consulted as part of composing his own. It's the one from Licinius Crassus. And indeed, the two friends, also seem to have discussed individual provisions of Cicero's edict. On one occasion, a member of the gens Sicilia, a certain Sicinius, maybe Pompey's Vir Monitalis in 49 BCE, weighed in on the matter. He seems to have proposed that Cicero include a certain exceptio, a restriction or defense, into his edict. While we do not know about Sicinius's motivations for making this suggestion, Cicero was quite explicit about the terms on which he thought about assenting to this proposal. Yes, he was indeed considering including the exceptio in question, that's fine, provided, of course, that it did not hurt anyone that had previously done him a service. As such, this passage would seem to indicate that Cicero could talk quite openly about the way in which the bonds of reciprocity that pervaded Roman society shaped the composition of his edict. With this in mind, I think we can return once again to Varus and to his edictal Nandinae. Against the background of these passages, it appears at least plausible that Cicero was really only taking issue with the market exchange nature, right, the Nundinae, of Varus's actions. As long as the principle of reciprocity governed how individuals and groups influenced individual edicts, this was not only a legitimate, but also a welcome process. As Cicero's own formulations suggest, the nature of the edict was such that it should not impinge on the obligations that the bonds of reciprocity placed on him. Crucially, Cicero's letters about his own edict do not only help us to contextualize Varus' edictal Nundinae. In what follows, I want to argue that these letters also allow us to begin thinking about some of the social forces that actually contributed to the conservative tendencies that many judicial edicts of Roman magistrates very likely displayed, I think. So let's return once more to Cicero's letter to Appius Claudius, in which he defended himself against the charge of being overly inimical to his predecessor. At the very end of the passage that I give you on the handout, Cicero seemingly tried to mount a more general defense of his actions, right? So he moved from defending individual provisions to sort of saying, look, any provision of his edict that Claudius has suspected of being aimed at hurting him, at hurting Claudius, actually can be found in previous edicts. Any such provisions, so Cicero claimed, were tralaticia, they were tralatition. And so here I want to make two observations in relation to this passage. The first relates to the use of the adjective tralaticium. In fact, this passage is the only instance of extant Republican prose in which that adjective is being used in relation to a judicial edict. Indeed, scholars often invoke this adjective, and this passage in particular, as an argument in support of the idea that certain parts of the edict remain stable between magistrates. However, this precise passage would seem to indicate that this adjective does not need to refer to this type of blind conservatism, this kind of blind copying out, that legal scholars would like to posit at all. In fact, this particular meaning would actually appear to be excluded in this passage, right? Because it seems rather unlikely that Claudius actually took issue with provisions in Cicero's edict that had also featured in his own. So I think we can begin to be more precise in how we characterize the supposed conservatism of judicial edicts. And this conservatism, I think, did not necessarily amount to seemingly blindly copying one's predecessor's texts. Instead, we can see here a case of considered selection from past models. So the past clearly mattered, but as something on which to purposefully draw, not as something that was mindlessly continued. And so my second observation then pertains to Cicero's defense strategies against Claudius' charges. Cicero appealed to the lack of newness of the provisions at issue. He had taken them all over from previous edicts. On one level, we can see how this argument might work, right? Cicero was claiming that he had not thought up something new just to hurt Claudius. At the same time, the argument does not seem to be fully conclusive. Appealing to precedent does not appear to get to the core of Claudius's charges. Sure, the provisions in question might have featured in previous edicts, but Cicero might also have chosen them precisely because he knew that they would hurt Claudius. Intriguingly, this letter is not the only occasion on which Cicero appealed to the not newness of certain edictal provisions in order to defend them against charges of bias. The second example stems from a letter to Atticus in which the two friends discussed certain charges that Atticus had leveled against an exceptio in the edict of Bibulus, who was governor of Syria at the time. According to Atticus, this exceptio was excessively severe in its attitude towards our order, most likely, I think, the equestrians. Cicero tried to allay Atticus's concern. He himself had included a similar clause in his edict, and this clause actually originally stemmed from Scaevola' edict. Again, one might wonder what the not newness of a certain provision might have to do with its bias or the way in which it affected a specific group of persons. I would like to interpret these arguments about the not newness of certain provisions as indicative of the larger political and legal culture in which Claudius, Atticus, and Cicero lived. These men appear to have lived in the world in which repeating previous provisions arguably worked as a way to counter criticism, because Searle would suggest it helped them deflect and avoid personal responsibility. And when making an edict, whether as Praetor urbanus in Rome or as magistrates in the provinces, there was a lot of responsibility to avoid. Right? In essence, these edicts determined the nature of justice. They said what would be just, what laws would be enforced in Rome, in the provinces, for 1 year. And as such, their composition was a high-stakes endeavor in which much could be gained, but also much could be lost, not least because of the way in which once existing provisions could readily be repeated. So here, just as a last point in this section, I want to it seems relevant to me that Atticus seems to have claimed that Bibulus's clause constituted a severe praejudicium against the equestrian order. Now, praejudicium can mean something like prejudgment or attitude. Much more frequently, though, it can be translated as precedent. Arguably then, we might be able to read Atticus here as saying that he was not just worried about Bibulus's bias towards the equestrian order, but also about the provision's potential for setting a precedent, right? About the possibility that once that clause had indeed featured in an edict, it would be much easier for subsequent parties, magistrates and litigants alike to justify its inclusion in future edicts. With this importance of the legal past, a strategical argument in mind, I now turn to the final section of my talk, in which I'll examine some of our evidence for the edicts of magistrates in Rome. First, to suggest that their composition might have taken place in analogous ways to the provinces, and then to illustrate the high stakes that indeed could be involved in making a judicial edict. Okay, so part 4 then, the making of edicts in the city of Rome. So let me begin by saying that Varus's alleged non-deny are the only ancient passage that I've been able to find which purports to describe how the judicial edicts of magistrates were being composed in the city of Rome. However, unlike in the provinces, there in Rome, we do seem to have evidence for the actual details of edictal provisions and how they changed over time. The classic case, the classic illustration of this is what legal scholars call the Interdictum de vi armata, of which I give you the 2 Republican versions that we have preserved on the handout under 4a. The purpose of this particular interdict is to outline one particular condition under which the magistrate in question would protect a possessor after they had lost possession. Although the text of the 2 interdicts is rather different, roughly speaking, the same circumstances are envisaged. The person in question had lost possession as a result of their opponent using brutal armed force, right? Vis armata. That being said, the lawsuits that could be instituted under these 2 edicts varied substantially. Most importantly, disputes instituted under the first version will have had to engage with the tricky concept of dolus malus, which I've translated with a similar technical term from English law, malice aforethought. In other words, under the first edict, arguments will have had to be made about the mental state of the evictor and the instrumentality of that mental state in making the whole eviction take place. By contrast, in trials under the second version of the edict, no arguments about mental states were necessary. Simple documentation of the fact of violent eviction at the hands of citizens or members of his household were enough. Among other things, this meant that slave owners could now be held liable for any and all violent evictions of the people they enslaved. And so we simply do not know what moved the Praetors of 73.2 and 69.8 to include these rather different provisions in their edicts. Whatever their motivations though, it seems clear that these variations promise success for rather different groups of claimants and suits. So in 73.2 BCE, not having evidence or knowledge about the mental state of the owner significantly decreased your chances of a successful outcome. By contrast, in 69.8 BCE, you might actually end up being held liable for acts of slaves that were legally somehow yours, but of whose acts you had no knowledge, whom you hadn't instructed, acts that you hadn't instructed, etc. So now, remember the passages I discussed in the first part of my paper, which I used to suggest that people in the city of Rome actually read the annual judicial edicts of magistrates. The case of the Interdictum de vi armata and its possibility for variation can help us understand why contemporaries might indeed have had an interest in doing such reading. Just as in the provinces, the provisions of edicts in the city of Rome, I think, could vary from year to year with profound and meaningful consequences for potential litigants. So yes, you better read what it says in the edict and you listen when it's being read out aloud. Consequently, one might also imagine that these litigants might have tried to influence the magistrates in question as they were composing their respective edicts. In the city of Rome, we would appear to have evidence for such attempts at influencing in various episodes surrounding death crises in the 1st century BCE. And it's to these episodes that I now turn as a final step in my argumentation. And I want to begin in the 80s BCE. So during that decade, the city of Rome appears to have experienced a set of severe debt crises, most likely because of a combination of the social war and the Mithridatic revolt in the Greek East. And we know about these crises through the concentration and accumulation of political measures taken in relation to debt and credit during this decade. The Praetor Urbanus in 89 BCE, that's Aulus Sempronius Asellio, is the first person on record to take such measures. And I give you Appian's descriptions of these measures on the handout under 4b. In short, Asellio instituted trials in favor of debtors, a decision for which creditors ultimately killed him in the forum. According to some sources, they did so just as he was sacrificing at the Temple of Concord. Right? It doesn't get better in Roman politics, I think. Okay, so Appian provides some details about the legal aspects of Asellio's actions. He shows us Asellio embroiled in conflicts between debtors and creditors, and he gives us some details about the arguments that the debtors were making. They seemingly appeal to the provisions of an old Roman statute which outlawed lending at interest. The annalistic tradition tells us about one such law, in fact, right, in the Selex Genucia from 342 BCE. In the 2nd century, we also know that Cato and other members of the Roman elite also appear to have taken sort of legal action or taken issue with Roman citizens lending out money at interest. But whatever the precise law to which the debtors appealed, they were seemingly using the authority of a statute, of a lex publica, to shape Asellio's judicial program. They were using statute to get him to refrain from offering actions that will allow creditors to recover their debt with interest. What is more likely, they also seem to have used the penal character of this old statute in question to turn the tables on the creditors, arguing that the creditors should be the ones to be sued and that the creditors should be the ones to pay out money, now as a penalty. Appian remains vague on what Asellio actually did. He tells us that the praetors shifted the impasse, the aporia, about law and custom onto the judges. At the same time, Appian also claimed that the lenders were angry because Asellio was indeed renewing anakanidstein, an old law, probably by the way in which he was setting the formulae according to which trials concerning debt and credit could be instituted. Whatever the precise nature of Asellio's actions, right, as judicial magistrate, he seems to have articulated a vision of justice that was radical within the context of its time. Crucially though, also he did not claim that he was doing anything new or innovative. Instead, he was simply upholding an old Roman lex, an argument that the debtors themselves had supplied to him. On one level then, we see here an awareness among the Roman population that some sort of precedent would help Roman magistrates articulate their version of justice, right, whatever that might be. At the same time, we also see a praetor that quite likely threw in his fate with one side in a profound and divisive societal debate. Ultimately, he did not survive it, as Appian would have it, because Asellio renewed the old statute, the lenders eventually killed him. So let me now turn to my second example, which is a bit more cheery. And it's about Marcus Gratiglianos, another praetor in the 80s BCE, who appears to have been luckier than Asellio. Gratiglianos published an addition to his edict during his term of office. While the nature of this measure is widely debated, it seems clear that the measure had something to do with the value of money and thus with the payment of debts and rents. And as Cicero recounts it, images of Gratiglianos after this measure, as Cicero recounted after this measure was passed, it was put forth, images of Gratiglianos began appearing in the Vici in the neighborhoods of the city of Rome in response to it. And people poured wine and burned incense in front of these images, right? So we should imagine a veritable temporary Gratiglianos cult all throughout the city of Rome, and all because of an edict with judicial ramifications. In light of these two episodes, I think we can also begin to understand why the advocates of the debtors' cause in Salus Bellum Catilinae did not simply complain that their creditors were oppressing them, right? This is passage 4d on the handout. As the debtors claimed, the creditors did so together with the Praetor Urbanus in Rome, because this Praetor Urbanus has failed to give them certain remedies in his edict. Also in this case, right, we learned that the creditors mentioned a particular lex, possibly an old statute, to which they were hoping to appeal, and that they argued would grant them, on could be the basis for such remedies. Together with the remainder of my paper, these 3 episodes pertaining to debt crises in 1st century BC Rome would allow for the following conclusions, I think. For one, we can diagnose a profound awareness among contemporaries in ancient Rome that the Edicts of Magistrates, in which they laid out the ways in which trials could be instituted during their 1 year of office, that these edicts were subject to change, and that they themselves, as potential litigants, might influence these changes. The Sicilian Publicani on Samos, right, the unidentified Sicinius in the letters to Cicero, and the debtors in the city of Rome in the 80s BCE and then later in the 60s BCE are the 3 examples or several examples that would appear to illustrate this dynamic most clearly, right? This dynamic of people saying, oh, the edict is subject to change and we're trying to influence it now. And as I stated at the beginning of my paper, in today's legal culture, we fear the exception, right? We feel the temporal suspension, rupture of the continued validity of legal norms. By contrast, I'm inclined to think that Romans actually had no problem with such exceptions or with variation more generally. In fact, regular annual variation appears to have been built into their legal and political culture, right? And not just with regard to magistrates, but as a result of this, also in regard to the laws that would be upheld each year in Rome. My second conclusion then pertains to the arguments that contemporaries made about this variation, about why the inclusion or exclusion of certain provisions from the edicts were right and good. Here the legal past, documented and, I would suggest, imagined, appears to have played a huge role. One might think of Cicero consulting previous edicts, of his arguments about certain provisions not being new, or of the repeated appeal to old statutes that debtors in Rome appear to have made. This preference in argumentation for what had already existed once before would seem to go hand in hand with what I think we should imagine were specific conservative tendencies in how Roman magistrates composed their judicial edicts. I would suggest that contemporaries expected such arguments about the legal past, both recent and remote, to be persuasive strategies for deflecting charges of partisanship in relation to certain provisions in the edict. Right, in Aselio's case, these strategies clearly failed, but in less spectacular instances, they might indeed have helped to shut down discussion. And here we also come to my third and final point. Such deflection seems to have been necessary precisely because in the late Republic, judicial edicts always were profoundly political. And by political, right here, I do not just mean that these provisions affected different people in differential ways. After all, this can really, I think, just be said of any legal norm. More importantly, I think we should see the provisions of judicial edicts as part of Roman political culture more broadly. These provisions and their changing combinations in any given edict were an essential part of how members of the political elite built their careers. Edicts allowed these men to make a name for themselves. They provided a way for these men to further develop the patronage networks in which they were inevitably enmeshed, and they gave these men a means by which to position themselves and intervene in the social, political, and economic questions of their day. Let me conclude then with a classic, with what I think is a classic Roman history move. Let's just briefly go back to Mommsen. So in the second volume of his Staatsrecht, Mommsen actually wrote about the edict, and it's the following lines that I've been able to find. Indes liegt es außerhalb der Grenzen des römischen Staatsrechts, diese ebenso feste und doch in stetigem Fluss bleibende Kodifikation, unzweifelhaft eines der vollkommensten Erzeugnisse der römischen Republik und noch in der verstümmelten kaiserlichen Zurechtmachung eine großartige Erscheinung im Einzelnen zu verfolgen. So this is a really, really rich passage, and I think much could be said about it. Here, I simply want to highlight that Mommsen excluded the edict from the purview of what to him was his staatsrechtliche perspective on Roman history. And so, first point here, this passage to me would seem to indicate that the exclusion of the edict from politics and from political history more generally, right, that I've thought to question in this paper, was not only the doing of legal scholars, right? Instead, this exclusion seems to have based on a mutual agreement among such legal scholars on the one hand and Roman historians on the other. More generally, this passage also allows me to sum up what I consider the broadest points of what I consider to be the broadest, most general point of my paper today. And I do hope, and that is, right, I do hope to have convinced you that the way in which we understand Mommsen's subject today, right, as the history of politics and of political culture, that is, that this particular version of his subject no longer requires the exclusion of judicial edicts from its purview. Indeed, I would maintain that much could indeed be gained by integrating these edicts and the history of private law more broadly into how we think about Roman politics and its history in general. So with this in mind, thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.